Lonely widow saves stray dog, never realizing it was the key to her late husband's secret fortune. Was the story Margaret Fletcher never imagined would become her own. At 63, she moved through her empty Victorian home like a ghost, touching surfaces her husband's hands had once touched, breathing air that no longer carried his scent. 6 months since Edward's heart attack, and still the house creaked with memories that refused to settle. Outside her frost-covered windows, late autumn painted Millfield in shades of burnished copper and gold, but Margaret's world remained colorless. She shuffled through her morning routine, tea with too much sugar, toast she rarely finished, and the slow, deliberate act of dressing herself in clothes Edward once complimented. Today, it was the navy cardigan he'd given her 3 Christmases ago, its elbows worn thin from the habit of wrapping her arms around herself. The neighbors had stopped bringing casseroles weeks ago. The sympathy cards gathered dust on her mantel. Her son James called dutifully every Sunday from Seattle, but their conversations had grown shorter, his patience for her grief thinning with each passing week. "You need to get out more, Mom," he'd said last weekend, his voice carrying that familiar tone of concern masked as casual suggestion. "Maybe join that garden club you always talked about." But Margaret had no interest in garden clubs or book circles or the senior center bingo nights her well-meaning friends kept inviting her to. What was the point of planting flowers when Edward wouldn't be there to see them bloom? What was the point of reading stories when she couldn't share them with him afterward, curled together on their porch swing? The modest pension Edward had left barely covered the property taxes on their aging home. The insurance money had gone to medical bills. The careful savings they'd accumulated over 40 years of marriage seemed to evaporate with each passing month. Margaret had been avoiding the bank statements piling up on Edward's old desk, knowing what they would tell her. Soon, she would have to sell the only home they had ever shared. This morning, like every morning since his passing, she carried her teacup to the bay window that overlooked their forgotten garden. The first frost had come early this year, crystallizing the untended roses and weathered fence posts. Edward had always been so proud of their garden. A little slice of heaven, he'd called it, spending weekend mornings tending to each plant with meticulous care. The garden, like Margaret, had lost its purpose without him. She was about to turn away when a flash of movement caught her eye. Something thin and gray darted between the withered rose bushes. Margaret squinted, pressing closer to the cold glass. There it was again, a dog, she realized. A terribly skinny thing with matted fur and a pronounced limp in its right hind leg. "Poor creature," she murmured, her breath fogging the window. The dog was sniffing around the garden shed, where Edward had kept his tools and, if memory served, the occasional bag of fertilizer. Margaret hadn't opened that shed since the funeral, couldn't bear to. The dog collapsed suddenly, lying flat on its side beside the shed door. Even from a distance, Margaret could see its ribs expanding rapidly with each labored breath. Something twisted in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months, concern for something outside herself. Before she could analyze this unexpected emotion, Margaret found herself slipping her feet into Edward's old gardening boots by the back door. Too big for her by several sizes, they made her shuffle awkwardly across the kitchen floor. She grabbed the half-empty package of bologna from the refrigerator, food James had brought during his last visit, trying to ensure she ate something with substance. The cold air bit through her cardigan as she stepped onto the back porch. She hesitated, one hand gripping the railing. She hadn't ventured into the garden since Edward's death. It felt like trespassing somehow, entering his domain without him. "Hello?" Her voice sounded foreign in the stillness of the forgotten garden. The dog's head jerked up, eyes wide with fear. It was a medium-sized creature, perhaps once white or light gray, though dirt and neglect had turned its coat a dingy color impossible to name. The animal tried to stand, failing on its first attempt before scrambling upright, poised to flee. No, Margaret said softly, holding out a piece of bologna between trembling fingers. "It's all right." "You're all right." The dog stared at her, its body tense. Margaret noticed one ear stood upright while the other flopped forward, giving it a perpetually curious expression despite its obvious distress. Its tail, thin and whip-like, made one uncertain wag. "You're hungry, aren't you?" Margaret took a tentative step forward, then another. The dog backed away slightly but seemed too weak to run. "I won't hurt you." When she was about 6 feet away, Margaret slowly knelt, ignoring the protest in her arthritic knees, and placed the bologna on the frosted grass. Then she retreated several steps, giving the animal space. For a long moment neither moved. Margaret holding her breath, the dog vibrating with indecision. Then hunger won out. The creature crept forward, snatched the meat with surprising speed, and retreated to devour it in 3 desperate gulps. "There's more," Margaret said, her voice catching unexpectedly. How long had it been since she'd spoken more than a few words to anyone other than the grocery clerk or her disinterested son over the phone? The dog's eyes, amber and intelligent, watched her every move as she placed another piece of bologna on the ground, this time a bit closer to where she stood. This offering disappeared as quickly as the first. By the 5th piece, the dog was eating from a spot only 2 feet away from Margaret's boots. "You need a proper meal," she told it, noticing how the animal's ears perked at the sound of her voice. "And probably a warm bath, too." The dog tilted its head as if considering her words. Margaret surprised herself with her next sentence. "Would you like to come inside?" It took nearly an hour of coaxing, more bologna and infinite patience, but eventually Margaret had the trembling dog in her kitchen. She filled an old mixing bowl with water, which the animal lapped up so furiously that half of it splashed onto the linoleum floor. The puddles didn't bother Margaret. The floor hadn't been properly cleaned in months anyway. "You need a name," she said, watching the dog investigate her kitchen with cautious curiosity. "Just until we find where you belong." The dog sniffed Edward's boots by the door, then looked up at Margaret with an expression she could have sworn held a question. "Those were my husband's," she explained, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Edward. He's not here anymore." The dog abandoned the boots and padded over to where Margaret sat at the kitchen table. Without warning, it rested its chin on her knee, looking up with those amber eyes. Something inside Margaret's chest cracked open, a fissure in the wall she'd built around her grief. Her hand, moving of its own accord, came to rest on the dog's head. Its fur was filthy but soft beneath the grime. The animal sighed, a sound so contented and trusting that Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time in weeks. "Chance," she decided, her voice thick. "I'll call you Chance." That night, after a messy bath that left Margaret's bathroom looking like a small tsunami had hit it, Chance settled on the rug beside her bed. Margaret had fully intended to make the dog sleep downstairs. Edward had never allowed pets on the furniture, let alone in their bedroom. But when she'd tried to leave Chance in the kitchen, the dog had whined so pitifully that Margaret found herself relenting. "Just for tonight," she told Chance sternly as she climbed into bed. But as she switched off the lamp and darkness enveloped the room that had felt too empty for too long, Margaret felt absurdly grateful for the sound of another breathing creature nearby. For the first time since Edward's death, she slept through the night. Morning arrived with a wet nose pressed against Margaret's hand, dangling over the edge of the bed. She startled awake, momentarily confused by the dog's presence before remembering yesterday's events. Chance's tail thumped against the floor in a steady rhythm, his expression expectant. "I suppose you need to go outside," Margaret said, her voice rough with sleep. She slipped on her robe, noticing that her body felt different somehow, less heavy, less reluctant to move. They established a routine over the next few days. Morning walks in the frost-covered garden, where Margaret noticed, for the first time since Edward's death, the resilient beauty of nature in transition. Afternoon trips to the small park 3 blocks away, where Chance's limp gradually improved with regular exercise. Evening meals shared at the kitchen table, Margaret slipping the dog pieces of chicken or beef while pretending to maintain some semblance of dinner-table discipline. "You're spoiling that animal," she could almost hear Edward say, though without real reproach. He had always been tender-hearted beneath his practical exterior. "He needs the protein," Margaret replied to the empty chair across from her. "He's still too thin." A week after Chance's arrival, Margaret realized she needed to make a decision. The responsible thing would be to take him to the local shelter, where they could check for a microchip, post his photo, try to find his original owners. But the thought of returning to her solitary existence made her stomach clench with dread. "You've become a selfish old woman," she scolded herself as she watched Chance explore the garden with growing confidence. His coat, after several baths, had revealed itself to be predominantly white with patches of light gray. His limp was barely noticeable now. Perhaps most remarkably, in the short time since his arrival, Margaret had ventured farther from home than she had in months. She'd spoken with the clerk at the pet store, exchanged pleasantries with fellow dog walkers at the park, even waved to neighbors she'd been avoiding. Each small interaction felt like emerging from a dark room into gradually brightening light, uncomfortable at first, then increasingly welcome. "Dr. Russell's office tomorrow," she told Chance as they sat on the porch swing that evening, her first time using it since Edward's passing. The dog rested his head on her lap, a gesture that had become his signature move. "You need vaccinations if you're staying, and I should at least have you scanned for a chip." Chance sighed, his amber eyes holding hers with what she fancied was gratitude. "Don't thank me yet," Margaret whispered, scratching behind his flopped ear. "I might still lose you." That night, a storm rolled through Millfield, bringing fierce winds that rattled the old Victorian's windows and sent tree branches scraping against the siding like skeletal fingers. Margaret, who had always found comfort in Edward's solid presence during thunderstorms, lay awake listening to the house creak and moan under nature's assault. Chance, seeming to sense her distress, abandoned his rug and jumped onto the bed without invitation. Before Margaret could scold him, he curled against her side, his warm weight anchoring her to the present moment, away from memories of other storms when Edward would make tea and tell stories until she fell asleep. "Edward would have a fit if he could see you now," she murmured, but her hand found Chance's fur in the darkness, drawing comfort from its softness. "But I suppose what he doesn't know won't hurt him." The storm intensified around midnight, a particularly violent gust sending something crashing in the backyard. Margaret sat upright, heart pounding. "That sounded like the shed door," she said to Chance, who lifted his head alertly. The garden shed had an old wooden door that had never quite latched properly. Edward had been meaning to fix it for years. Margaret slipped out of bed and peered through the rain-streaked window, but the night was too dark to see anything clearly. "If that door breaks off completely, everything inside will be ruined," she fretted. Edward's treasured tools, handed down from his father. The antique gardening books he'd collected over decades. "Stay here," she told Chance, pulling on her robe and grabbing a flashlight from the bedside drawer. But the dog had other ideas, jumping down and following close at her heels as she descended the stairs. At the back door, Margaret hesitated, listening to the howling wind. It had been months since she'd ventured outside after dark. The thought of facing the storm-tossed garden, of approaching the shed that held so many pieces of Edward, made her palms sweat despite the chill in the air. Chance nudged her hand with his nose, as if offering encouragement. "All right," Margaret said, squaring her shoulders. "Quick out and back." The rain hit her like a shower of ice needles as she stepped onto the porch. The beam of her flashlight bounced erratically across the garden, revealing wind-whipped plants and scattered debris. When it reached the shed, Margaret's suspicions were confirmed. The door hung precariously from one hinge, banging rhythmically against the frame with each gust of wind. "Come on!" she called to Chance, who trotted faithfully beside her as she made her way down the slippery path. By the time they reached the shed, Margaret was drenched, her nightgown clinging to her legs, her slippers squelching with each step. The interior of the shed smelled exactly as she remembered, a mixture of earth, metal, and the faint sweetness of the cedar wood Edward had used to line the walls. Her flashlight revealed familiar shadows, rakes and shovels hanging from hooks, terracotta pots stacked in graduated sizes, Edward's workbench along the back wall. Margaret propped the door closed as best she could, wedging one of the smaller pots against it to keep it from banging. She was about to turn back toward the house when she noticed Chance behaving strangely. The dog was sniffing intently at the floorboards beneath Edward's workbench, his tail straight and alert. "What is it, boy?" "A mouse." Margaret directed her flashlight to the spot. Nothing seemed unusual about the worn wooden planks. Chance looked up at her, then back at the floor, pawing insistently at one particular board. "We need to get back inside," Margaret said, shivering as cold rainwater trickled down her spine. "Whatever it is can wait until morning." But Chance was not to be deterred. He scratched more vigorously at the spot, whining softly. "Stubborn creature?" Margaret muttered, but found herself kneeling stiffly beside the dog, directing her flashlight beam more carefully at the area that had captured his attention. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar, aged floorboards Edward had installed decades ago. Then, as Chance continued to paw at one specific plank, Margaret noticed something odd. This board was slightly shorter than the others, with a tiny gap at one end. "What on earth?" She ran her fingers along the edge of the board, feeling a slight difference in height. Curious now, despite her discomfort, Margaret pressed down on one end of the plank and was astonished when the opposite end lifted slightly, revealing a small notch, just enough to grip with her fingers. Heart suddenly racing, she set the flashlight down and used both hands to lift the board completely. Beneath it was a hollow space about the size of a shoebox, and nestled inside that space was an actual box, metal, with a small combination lock securing its lid. "Edward," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "What did you hide here?" The box was surprisingly heavy as she lifted it from its hiding place. Chance sat back on his haunches, watching intently as Margaret brushed dust from the lid with trembling fingers. "We need to get this back to the house," she decided, tucking the box under one arm and retrieving her flashlight. The storm seemed to have intensified, rain now coming down in sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet. Margaret clutched the mysterious box to her chest and made a dash for the back door, Chance bounding ahead to lead the way. Once inside, dripping water all over the kitchen floor, Margaret set the box on the table and stared at it, heart pounding with equal parts anticipation and dread. What secrets had Edward kept hidden beneath their garden shed? In 40 years of marriage, he had never once mentioned a hidden box, a secret compartment, anything that might explain this discovery. "What do you think, Chance?" she asked the dog, who had settled at her feet, his mission apparently accomplished. "Should I open it?" The combination lock presented an immediate challenge. Margaret had no idea what numbers might unlock it. She tried their anniversary, July 15th, with no success. Then Edward's birthday, her birthday, the date they'd moved into the house. Nothing worked. Frustration building, Margaret made them both a late-night snack, cheese and crackers for her, a scoop of dog food for Chance, while contemplating the mysterious box. "He must have left a clue somewhere," she mused, absently twisting her wedding ring, a habit formed over decades. Edward was methodical. He wouldn't have created a locked box without ensuring a way for it to be opened if necessary. As she spoke Edward's name, her gaze fell on the collection of framed photographs lining the hallway wall. Their wedding day, James's birth, family vacations, anniversary celebrations, a visual timeline of their life together. With sudden inspiration, Margaret hurried to examine them. In the center of the arrangement hung their favorite photograph, Edward and Margaret on their 25th anniversary, standing before the garden rose trellis he had built as a gift to her that year. The frame was slightly more ornate than the others, with a pattern of intertwined vines carved into the wood. Edward had made it himself in his workshop. Margaret carefully lifted the frame from its hook and turned it over. The backing seemed ordinary, but when she pressed it gently around the edges, she felt something unusual. A slight depression in one corner. Heart racing, she worked her fingernail under the edge of the backing and pried it loose. Behind the anniversary photo, tucked into the frame, was a small piece of paper. Written in Edward's neat, precise handwriting were 3 numbers, 624-8. "Clever man," Margaret whispered, tears suddenly blurring her vision. She returned to the kitchen, Chance following attentively, and carefully turned the dials on the lock to match the sequence. With a soft click, the mechanism released. Margaret hesitated, her hand resting on the lid. Did she truly want to know what Edward had kept hidden from her? What if it was something painful, evidence of a secret life, financial troubles he'd shielded her from? Or worse? Chance nudged her elbow with his nose as if urging her forward. "All right then," Margaret said, taking a deep breath. "Let's see what secrets you were keeping, Edward Fletcher." She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet cloth, lay several items: a leather-bound journal, a USB drive, a small velvet pouch, and an envelope with Margaret's name written on it in Edward's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope first. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, and somehow you've discovered my little secret. I hope it didn't take too long. I've always trusted your remarkable intelligence would lead you here eventually. What you've found represents the culmination of a dream I've harbored for decades, one I kept from you not out of mistrust, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain before getting your hopes up. You see, 30 years ago, when we were struggling to make ends meet with a young James and that mountain of medical bills, I made a small investment with my inheritance from Dad. That small beginning grew, slowly at first, then more rapidly as the years passed. I diversified, reinvested, and watched over this nest egg with the same attention I gave to our roses. The journal contains all the details, every transaction, every decision. The USB drive holds digital records, account numbers, and access credentials. Why didn't I tell you? At first, I wanted it to be a surprise for our retirement, a grand reveal when the time was right. Then, as the amounts grew more substantial, I worried. What if something went wrong? What if I lost it all? I couldn't bear to disappoint you. So I waited, always telling myself, just a little longer, just a little more security. Then came my heart troubles, and suddenly, time became precious in a way I never understood before. I planned to show you everything on our upcoming anniversary, but it seems fate had other ideas. The velvet pouch contains the key to a safe deposit box at Millfield Community Bank. Box number 403. Everything is in your name now. I'm sorry for keeping this from you, my love. I hope you can forgive an old man's foolishness. Know that every investment, every careful decision was made with one thought in mind, ensuring that the woman who made my life worth living would never want for anything after I was gone. All my love, for all time. Edward. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Chance rested his head on her lap, a steady presence as her world shifted once again. With shaking hands, she opened the velvet pouch and found a small key, just as Edward had described. The journal revealed Edward's meticulous record-keeping, page after page of transactions, investments, and notes spanning 3 decades. Though Margaret had never taken much interest in finances, leaving that aspect of their life largely to Edward, even she could see that the final figures were substantial. Far more than substantial. Astounding. The storm outside had quieted, dawn beginning to lighten the sky. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, Edward's secret laid bare before her, Chance dozing at her feet. A strange calm had settled over her, replacing the initial shock. He thought he was protecting me, she told Chance, who opened one eye at the sound of her voice. All these years, working in secret to make sure I'd be taken care of. The dog thumped his tail against the floor. And you? Margaret continued, leaning down to scratch behind Chance's ears. Somehow you knew exactly where to look. As if he sent you to make sure I found it. The thought sent a peculiar warmth through her chest. Edward had always believed that the universe worked in mysterious ways, that there were no true coincidences. Everything happens for a reason, Maggie, he would say whenever life took unexpected turns. Was Chance one of those reasons? A stray dog appearing in her garden just when she needed direction, leading her directly to Edward's hidden legacy? Well, Margaret said, wiping the last of her tears and straightening her shoulders. We have an appointment at the vet this morning, and apparently another one at the bank afterward. As if understanding, Chance stood and stretched, ready to face the day alongside her. Doctor. Russell's veterinary clinic was warm and inviting, smelling of antiseptic and pet treats. Margaret sat nervously in the waiting room, Chance leaning against her leg. She had spent the morning bathing and brushing him, wanting him to make a good impression. What if he already belonged to someone? What if there was a family somewhere missing him, putting up flyers, wondering where their beloved pet had disappeared to? The thought of losing Chance now, after all that had happened, made Margaret's chest tighten painfully. Mrs. Fletcher, a veterinary assistant, appeared at the door. We're ready for Chance. The examination went smoothly. Dr. Russell, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, pronounced Chance approximately 3 years old, remarkably healthy despite his recent period of neglect, and, most crucially, without a microchip. He's not registered to anyone, Dr. Russell confirmed, stroking Chance's head. Given his condition when you found him, I'd guess he's been on his own for quite some time. So I could keep him? Margaret asked, hardly daring to hope. Dr. Russell smiled. I don't see why not. We'll put his information in our found pets database in case someone is looking for him, but honestly, he seems quite attached to you already. I think you two found each other at just the right time. Everything happens for a reason, Maggie. Their next stop was Millfield Community Bank, where Margaret presented her identification and Edward's key. The manager escorted her personally to the vault area, his manner becoming increasingly deferential as he verified her information in the system. Mr. Fletcher was one of our most valued clients, he explained as they walked. He spoke of you often, Mrs. Fletcher. This was news to Margaret. He did? Oh, yes. He was very proud of you, mentioned your gardening skills, your patience with his hobbies, your strength through James's childhood illness. He said you were the backbone of the family. They reached the safe deposit box room, where Margaret was left alone with box number 403. Chance had to wait in the manager's office, but Margaret felt Edward's presence beside her as she inserted the key and pulled out the long metal container. Inside were documents, many documents, stock certificates, deeds, investment portfolios, a detailed inventory of accounts at various financial institutions, and beneath it all a final letter, shorter than the first. Maggie, by now you understand the full scope of what I've built for us. For you. The current value, as of my last accounting, exceeds $3.4 million. It's all yours now. Live well, my love. Be generous to yourself in all the ways you've always been generous to others. Travel to those places we always talked about. Renovate the garden. Help James with the grandchildren's education. Support the causes we believed in. And please don't be angry with me for keeping this secret. I only ever wanted to see you smile. Forever yours, Edward. $3.4 million. The figure seemed impossible. They had lived so modestly, always careful with money, occasionally indulging in small luxuries but never anything extravagant. How had Edward amassed such wealth without her noticing? The answer lay in his methodical nature, his attention to detail, his infinite patience. The same qualities that had made him such a wonderful gardener had apparently made him an exceptional investor as well. When Margaret emerged from the bank 2 hours later, after meetings with the manager and the bank's financial advisor, she felt as though she were walking through a dream. Chance greeted her enthusiastically, seeming to sense her altered state. "Well," she told him as they walked toward home, "it appears we can afford that expensive dog food after all." The following weeks brought transformations large and small to Margaret's life. With the guidance of a financial advisor, thoroughly vetted and recommended by 3 separate sources, as Edward would have insisted, she established a clear understanding of her new circumstances and developed a plan that balanced security with generosity. Her first decision was to stay in their Victorian home, but with improvements. The roof that had worried Edward for years was replaced. The ancient furnace upgraded to something more efficient. The garden, which had fallen into disrepair, became her passion project, a way to honor Edward while moving forward. She called James with the news, carefully explaining what she had discovered. His initial disbelief gave way to amazement, then a kind of retroactive pride in his father's achievement. "Dad always played things close to the vest," James said, his voice warm with understanding. "Remember how he wouldn't let anyone see his woodworking projects until they were completely finished? He couldn't bear to present anything that wasn't perfect." "Yes," Margaret agreed, watching Chance chase a squirrel across the newly landscaped garden. That was Edward to a T. "So what now, Mom? Round-the-world cruise? Sports car? New wardrobe?" Margaret laughed, surprising herself with how natural it felt. "Nothing so dramatic, though I am thinking of sponsoring a section at the animal shelter. They need a new medical facility." The idea had come to her during her 3rd visit to the shelter, where she had gone to donate supplies and find a companion for Chance. The staff there had shown her their cramped examination room, explaining apologetically how they struggled to provide adequate care with limited resources. Margaret had left with both a senior cat named Jasper, who now regarded the house as his personal kingdom, graciously allowing Margaret and Chance to share it, and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. As autumn gave way to winter, Margaret found herself busier than she had been in decades. The animal shelter project expanded to include a community education program. She joined the garden club after all, bringing Edward's horticultural books to share. She started having James and his family visit monthly instead of quarterly, the guest rooms no longer shrines to the past, but warm spaces ready for new memories. And through it all, Chance remained by her side, on walks through the frost-covered park, during meetings with contractors and shelter staff, beside her on the porch swing where she now sat most evenings, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the neighborhood settle into night. "He would have loved you," she told Chance one evening as the first snow of winter began to dust the garden. Edward pretended to be practical about animals, but he was a softy at heart. Chance, curled beside her with his head on her lap, sighed contentedly. The holidays approached, bringing with them a wave of memories that still stung but no longer paralyzed. Margaret hung the Christmas decorations Edward had collected over the years, placing each ornament with care and sharing stories with Chance as if the dog could understand the significance of each glittering bauble. "This star was from our first Christmas together," she explained, holding up a slightly tarnished silver ornament. "We couldn't afford proper decorations, so Edward made this from an old tin can. Isn't it beautiful? On Christmas Eve, with James and his family due to arrive the next morning, Margaret found herself drawn to the garden shed. The structure had been reinforced during the home renovations, its contents organized but largely unchanged. Edward's presence felt strongest here, among the tools he had used with such care. She sat on his old work stool, Chance lying at her feet, and looked around at the familiar space now cast in a new light. The hiding place beneath the floorboards remained, now empty but preserved as a reminder of Edward's secret work on her behalf. "I think I understand now," she said softly, her breath visible in the winter air. "You were always planning for a future you feared you might not share. Even before your heart gave you warnings." A familiar ache filled her chest, but it was different now, bittersweet rather than devastating. She missed Edward with an intensity that would never fully fade, but the gratitude she felt for his final gift had begun to balance the scales of grief. That gift wasn't just the financial security, though that was certainly significant. It was the knowledge that he had worked silently for decades with her well-being as his only goal. It was the continuation of his protection and care, reaching beyond his lifetime into hers. It was love, expressed in the practical, tangible way that had always been Edward's style. And perhaps, Margaret thought as Chance nuzzled her hand with his damp nose, Edward's gift included this unlikely companion as well, this creature who had appeared exactly when she needed direction, who had led her unerringly to the hidden box, who had restored purpose and connection to her diminished world. "Come on, boy," she said, rising from the stool and patting her thigh. "Let's get inside before we freeze. We have a busy day tomorrow." As they crossed the garden together, snow crunching beneath her boots and Chance's paws, Margaret paused to look up at the night sky. A few stars were visible between scattered clouds, bright and clear in the winter darkness. "Thank you," she whispered, not entirely sure who she was addressing. Edward, the universe, or perhaps the resilient spark within herself that had survived unimaginable loss and found a way forward. Chance pressed against her leg, a warm and steady presence. Margaret smiled and continued toward the house, where lights glowed in windows that no longer seemed empty, where photographs held memories that comforted rather than haunted, where a future she had never imagined waited to unfold. The lonely widow who had saved a stray dog had, in turn, been saved herself. And somewhere, Margaret liked to believe, Edward was smiling, pleased with how his final plan had worked out in ways even he could never have foreseen. Everything, after all, happens for a reason.